The chains bit deep into Clara Whitmore's wrists as the wagon lurched forward, each pothole sending fresh waves of agony through her already battered body. The jeers from the crowd grew louder as they approached the town square of Millbrook, Texas, where a makeshift gallows awaited her arrival. What the bloodthirsty mob didn't know was that among them stood a man who would change everything, a cowboy whose conscience wouldn't let him watch an innocent woman die for crimes she never committed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook as Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison adjusted his badge for what he believed would be the last time. The weight of it felt heavier than usual against his chest, not from the metal itself, but from the burden of what he was about to witness. In less than an hour, Clara Whitmore would hang for the murder of banker Theodore Blackwood, and Jake knew with every fiber of his being that an innocent woman was about to die. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful night when Blackwood's body was discovered in his study, a knife buried deep between his shoulder blades. The evidence against Clara seemed overwhelming at first glance, her handkerchief found clutched in the dead man's fist, witnesses who claimed to have seen her leaving the banker's mansion around the time of the murder, and most damning of all, the blood-stained dress hidden in her boarding house room. But Jake had been there when Sheriff Wade Hutchinson and his men conducted their investigation, and something hadn't sat right with him from the very beginning. The handkerchief, while bearing Clara's initials, was too clean, too perfectly placed. The witnesses were all men who owed Blackwood money, men who would say anything to get on the good side of whoever held power in Millbrook. And that dress, supposedly evidence of Clara's guilt, had been discovered only after the sheriff's men had already searched her room twice. Clara Whitmore had arrived in Millbrook 6 months earlier, stepping off the afternoon stage with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a letter of recommendation from a finishing school back east. She'd taken work as a seamstress for Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, the mayor's wife, and had quickly earned a reputation for her skill with needle and thread. More importantly, she'd earned the respect of the decent folk in town through her kindness and quiet dignity. Jake had first noticed her on a Sunday morning at the Methodist church, where she sat alone in the back pew, her auburn hair catching the light that streamed through the stained glass windows. She had a way of carrying herself that spoke of inner strength, despite the obvious hardship she'd endured. Her hands bore the calluses of hard work, and her clothes, while clean and well-mended, showed the signs of having been worn for many seasons. It was after the church social that Jake had first spoken to her, offering to carry her basket as she walked back to her boarding house. She'd accepted with a shy smile, and they'd talked about simple things: the weather, the sermon, the beautiful wildflowers that bloomed along the creek that ran behind the town. There was something about Clara that drew Jake in, a gentleness that seemed rare in a town where most people were hardened by the harsh realities of frontier life. Over the following months, Jake found excuses to visit Mrs. Pemberton's dress shop when he knew Clara would be working. He'd bring news from around town, check on the security of the building, or simply stop by to ensure everything was peaceful. Clara would always greet him with that same warm smile, and slowly their conversations grew longer and more personal. She told him about her life back in Virginia, how she'd grown up on a small farm before her parents died in a fever epidemic. She'd worked as a governess for several wealthy families, but times had grown hard, and she decided to head west for a fresh start. Jake shared stories of his own past growing up as the son of a blacksmith in Oklahoma Territory, learning to ride and shoot before he could properly read, and eventually finding his way to law enforcement when the territory began to organize. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a connection that grew stronger with each passing week. Jake had never been one for fancy words or grand gestures, but Clara seemed to appreciate his straightforward honesty and genuine concern for her well-being. When he walked her home from church or from her work, he felt a contentment he'd never experienced before. But their growing relationship hadn't gone unnoticed by Theodore. Blackwood, the banker, was a man in his 50s, well-dressed and influential, with fingers in every profitable venture in Millbrook. He owned the largest house in town, employed half the men who lived there, and had the ear of every politician within 100 miles. Blackwood had also developed an unhealthy obsession with Clara Whitmore from the moment she'd arrived in town. Jake had witnessed Blackwood's unwanted attention firsthand. The banker would find reasons to visit Mrs. Pemberton's shop when Clara was working, always with some excuse about needing alterations to his clothing or discussing business with the mayor's wife. But Jake could see the way Blackwood looked at Clara with a hunger that made his skin crawl. Clara herself had confided in Jake about the banker's inappropriate comments and increasingly bold attempts to corner her alone. The situation had reached a breaking point 2 days before Blackwood's murder. Jake had been making his evening rounds when he heard Clara's voice, sharp with fear and anger, coming from the alley behind the dress shop. He'd rushed around the corner to find Blackwood pressing Clara against the brick wall, his hands on her shoulders, trying to force a kiss upon her. Jake's reaction had been immediate and violent. He'd grabbed Blackwood by the collar and thrown him against the opposite wall, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. The banker had straightened his rumpled clothing with as much dignity as he could muster, but his face had been red with embarrassment and rage. "This isn't over, Morrison," Blackwood had hissed, his voice low and threatening. "You'd do well to remember who runs this town and who signs your paychecks." Jake had stepped closer, his voice equally quiet, but filled with deadly promise. "You touch her again, Blackwood, and badge or no badge, I'll put you in the ground myself." The banker had left without another word, but Jake had seen the calculation in his eyes, the wheels turning as he planned his revenge. Clara had been shaken, but unharmed, and Jake had walked her safely back to her boarding house. They'd talked quietly on her front porch, and for a moment, Jake had thought about telling her how he felt, about asking her to consider a future with him. But the timing hadn't felt right, and he'd left with only a gentle squeeze of her hand and a promise to check on her the next day. 2 nights later, Theodore Blackwood was dead, and Clara Whitmore was in chains. The trial, if it could be called that, had been a mockery of justice. Judge Samuel Hartwell, who owed his position to political favors and his continued employment to men like Blackwood, had made it clear from the beginning that he considered Clara guilty. The prosecutor, a thin, nervous man named Edgar Finch, had presented the evidence against Clara with theatrical flourish, painting her as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered Blackwood when he rejected her advances. Jake had watched from the gallery as Clara sat at the defendant's table, her back straight despite the weight of the accusations against her. She'd been assigned a court-appointed attorney, a young man fresh out of law school who seemed more interested in ending the trial quickly than in mounting any kind of defense. When Clara had tried to speak on her own behalf, explaining that she'd been in her room all evening with her landlady, Mrs. Sarah Murphy, as a witness, the prosecutor had dismissed Mrs. Murphy's testimony as unreliable due to her advanced age and poor eyesight. The verdict had been delivered after less than an hour of deliberation. Guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence, death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence. Jake had tried everything he could think of to stop the execution. He'd appealed to Sheriff Hutchinson, reminding him of the inconsistencies in the evidence and the rushed nature of the investigation. The sheriff had dismissed his concerns with a wave of his hand, suggesting that Jake's judgment was clouded by his obvious feelings for the accused. He'd ridden to the county seat to speak with higher authorities, but found that Blackwood's influence extended far beyond Millbrook. The men he spoke with either wouldn't listen or made it clear that they had no interest in challenging a verdict that had already been decided by their social and political superiors. Jake had even considered breaking Clara out of jail, but the building was old and sturdy, and Hutchinson had posted guards around the clock after Jake's first appeal. Any attempt at a jailbreak would likely result in Clara being shot while trying to escape, giving the sheriff the excuse he needed to end the matter even more quickly. As the days passed and the execution drew near, Jake found himself facing an impossible choice. He could stand by and watch an innocent woman die, preserving his position and his reputation in the community. Or he could take a stand that would cost him everything, but might save Clara's life. The answer came to him on the night before the execution, as he sat alone in his small cabin on the outskirts of town, staring at the badge in his hands. His father had always told him that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned or what position he held, but by what he was willing to sacrifice for what was right. Jake had worn the badge for 3 years, believing that it represented justice and the protection of the innocent. But what good was the badge if it couldn't protect someone like Clara from the corruption and prejudice that had condemned her? As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Jake made his decision. He would not stand by and watch Clara Whitmore hang for a crime she didn't commit. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, he would find a way to save her. Sound of the crowd gathering in the town square drifted through his cabin window, a mixture of excited voices and shuffling feet that made his stomach turn. People were already claiming the best spots to watch the execution, treating it like some kind of entertainment rather than the legal murder of an innocent woman. Jake strapped on his gun belt and checked his weapon, ensuring it was loaded and ready. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew that when the moment came, he would be ready to act. He'd spent the night thinking through various scenarios, considering every possible angle and outcome. The wagon carrying Clara would have to pass right by the spot where Jake planned to position himself. Sheriff Hutchinson and his deputies would be focused on the crowd and the gallows, not expecting any trouble from one of their own. If Jake could create enough confusion, he might be able to get Clara away from her guards and onto a horse. From there, they could head for the territorial border, where Hutchinson's authority ended, and they might find sanctuary. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but it was the only chance Clara had. As Jake prepared to leave his cabin, he took one last look around at the life he was about to abandon. The simple furniture he'd built with his own hands, the books he'd collected over the years, the few personal possessions that connected him to his past and his family. After today, he would never see this place again, never wear the badge that had defined his identity for so long. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as he thought of Clara sitting in that dark jail cell, facing death for a crime she didn't commit, Jake knew he was making the right choice. Some things were more important than career or comfort or even personal safety. Some things were worth risking everything for. The sun was fully up now, and Jake could hear the wagon wheels creaking as the execution party began to move through town. It was time to go. Time to find out what kind of man he really was when everything was on the line. Jake Morrison walked out of his cabin and into the dusty street, his hand resting on the butt of his gun and his heart pounding with the knowledge that the next few minutes would determine not just Clara's fate, but his own as well. The wagon wheels ground against the packed earth as the execution procession made its way down Main Street, each turn bringing Clara closer to the gallows that awaited her in the town square. She sat with her back straight, despite the iron shackles that bound her wrists and ankles, refusing to give the jeering crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break. The morning air was thick with dust and the smell of unwashed bodies pressed together in anticipation of the spectacle about to unfold. Sheriff Wade Hutchinson rode alongside the wagon, his chest puffed out with self-importance as he acknowledged the cheers from his supporters in the crowd. Behind him, deputies Frank Lawson and Billy McCarty kept their hands near their weapons, scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. They'd heard rumors that some folks might try to interfere with the execution, though Hutchinson doubted anyone would be foolish enough to challenge his authority so openly. Clara's eyes searched the faces in the crowd, looking for any sign of sympathy or support. Most of what she saw was hunger for violence, the same bloodlust that had driven lynch mobs throughout the frontier. But scattered among the hostile faces were a few that showed doubt, uncertainty, even pity. Mrs. Catherine Wells, who ran the general store, turned away when Clara's eyes met hers. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, removed his hat and bowed his head slightly in what might have been a gesture of respect or apology. Near the front of the crowd, Clara spotted Mrs. Sarah Murphy, her elderly landlady, who had tried so desperately to provide an alibi during the trial. The old woman's face was streaked with tears, and she clutched a handkerchief to her chest. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Mrs. Murphy mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," before the crowd shifted and blocked her from view. The wagon lurched to a stop in front of Patterson's saloon, where a group of ranch hands had gathered to watch the proceedings. Their leader, a burly man named Rex Coleman, who worked for the Circle K Ranch, stepped forward with a bottle of whiskey in his hand. "Hold up there, Sheriff," Coleman called out, his words slurred from drinking. "How about we give the lady a final drink before she meets her maker?" The crowd laughed and cheered at the suggestion, but Hutchinson held up his hand for silence. "The prisoner will face her judgment with a clear head, Coleman. Now step back and let us pass." Coleman wasn't finished with his performance. He stumbled closer to the wagon, leering at Clara with bloodshot eyes. Shame such a pretty thing had to go and kill a man. Could have had herself a good life if she'd just known her place. "That's enough." The voice came from the crowd, sharp and commanding. Jake Morrison pushed through the press of bodies, his badge catching the morning sunlight. Several people stepped aside as they recognized the deputy, though others pressed closer, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. "Morrison," Hutchinson acknowledged with a nod, though his eyes were wary. "Come to see justice done?" Jake positioned himself near the wagon, close enough to Clara that she could see the determination in his face. For the first time since her arrest, she felt a spark of hope. "Just making sure everything stays orderly, Sheriff. We don't want any trouble." Coleman wasn't ready to back down. "Ain't no trouble here, Deputy. Just having a little fun with the condemned woman. Nothing wrong with that, is there?" Jake's hand moved to rest on the butt of his gun, a gesture that wasn't lost on Coleman or the crowd around them. "I'd say there's plenty wrong with it. Why don't you and your boys head back inside and let the law handle its business?" The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Coleman's friends shifted nervously behind him, suddenly aware that they were facing a man who had a reputation for being quick with his gun and accurate with his aim. Coleman himself seemed to realize that he'd pushed things too far, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "Sure thing, Deputy," Coleman said finally, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Wouldn't want to interfere with the law." He took a long pull from his bottle and grinned. "Though I reckon we'll all be watching when that rope goes tight around her pretty neck." Jake took a step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You say another word about the prisoner, Coleman, and you'll be spending the next month in jail nursing a broken jaw." This time Coleman did back down, retreating to the saloon porch with his companions. But the damage was done. The crowd was now fully aroused, their bloodlust stirred by the confrontation they'd just witnessed. Voices rose in excitement as people speculated about what they'd seen and what it might mean. Hutchinson urged his horse closer to Jake, his voice low but angry. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Morrison? Your job is to keep the peace, not to start fights with the citizens." "My job is to protect people from harm," Jake replied, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "That includes protecting prisoners from harassment while they're in custody." "The prisoner is going to be dead in 15 minutes, Hutchinson snapped. "What happens to her after that won't be your concern or mine." Clara heard the exchange and felt her heart sink. Even Jake's intervention couldn't change the fact that she was about to die for a crime she didn't commit. The brief moment of hope she'd felt began to fade, replaced by the cold certainty of her fate. The wagon began to move again, turning the corner that would bring them into the town square where the gallows waited. Clara could see the wooden structure, now hastily built but sturdy enough for its grim purpose. A rope hung from the crossbeam, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Below it, a platform with a trapdoor that would open at the pull of a lever. Reverend Marcus Stone stood near the gallows, his Bible clutched in his hands and his face pale with distress. He'd visited Clara in jail the night before, offering what comfort he could and listening to her final confession of innocence. Like many others in town, he had doubts about Clara's guilt, but he was powerless to stop what was about to happen. The crowd in the square was even larger than the one that had lined the streets. People had come from surrounding farms and ranches, some traveling for hours to witness the execution. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders for a better view, while vendors moved through the crowd selling fresh bread and coffee to those who wanted to make a morning of the entertainment. Judge Samuel Hartwell stood on a raised platform near the gallows, dressed in his formal robes despite the heat of the day. Beside him, Prosecutor Edgar Finch shuffled through papers, preparing for the final formalities that would precede the execution. Both men looked satisfied with the morning's proceedings, confident that justice was about to be served. As the wagon drew closer to the gallows, Clara's composure finally began to crack. Her hands, bound though they were, began to tremble, and her breathing became shallow and rapid. She tried to prepare herself for this moment, but the reality of her impending death was overwhelming. Jake saw her distress and moved his horse closer to the wagon. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice just loud enough for her to hear, "look at me." She turned toward him, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. In that moment, Jake saw not just the woman he'd grown to care for, but every innocent person who had ever been failed by a system that was supposed to protect them. His resolve hardened into something unbreakable. "Whatever happens," Jake said, his voice steady and sure, "know that someone believes in your innocence. Someone knows the truth." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The wagon came to a stop directly in front of the gallows. Sheriff Hutchinson dismounted and began barking orders to his deputies, directing them to clear a path through the crowd and secure the area around the platform. The executioner, a hooded man brought in from another county, stepped forward to check the rope and test the trapdoor mechanism. Judge Hartwell called for silence, his voice carrying across the square. "Citizens of Millbrook and surrounding areas, we are gathered here today to witness the execution of Clara Whitmore, found guilty by a jury of her peers of the murder of Theodore Blackwood. The sentence of death by hanging will now be carried out according to the laws of this territory." Jake watched as deputies Lawson and McCarty moved to either side of the wagon, preparing to escort Clara to the gallows. His mind raced through the plan he'd formulated during the sleepless night before. He would have only seconds to act, and everything would have to go perfectly if Clara was going to have any chance of survival. The deputy sheriff positioned himself near his horse, his hand resting casually on his gun. To the casual observer, he appeared to be simply maintaining order, but every muscle in his body was coiled and ready for action. He'd spotted the two horses he'd arranged to have waiting behind Henderson's Mercantile, their reins tied to a hitching post but loose enough to be quickly freed. Clara was helped down from the wagon, her shackled feet making the descent awkward and dangerous. The crowd pressed closer, eager to get a better view of the condemned woman. Some shouted insults and accusations, while others maintained a respectful silence. The cacophony of voices created a wall of sound that would help mask any sudden action. Jake might take as Clara was led toward the gallows steps. She stumbled slightly, her legs weak from fear and the awkward gait imposed by her ankle shackles. Deputy McCarty reached out to steady her, but his grip was rough and impersonal, treating her more like a sack of grain than a human. Being about to lose her life, Jake's jaw tightened as he watched the casual cruelty of the scene. Clara had committed no crime, except being in the wrong place at the wrong time, being vulnerable and without powerful allies to protect her. She was about to die because Theodore Blackwood was dead and someone had to pay for it, and she was the most convenient target. The crowd grew quieter as Clara began to climb the steps to the gallows platform, the reality of what they were about to witness finally sinking in for some of them. This wasn't a story in a dime novel or a tale told around a campfire. This was a real woman, someone they'd seen in church and at the general store, about to have her life ended in front of them. Reverend Stone stepped forward as Clara reached the platform, offering to say a final prayer with her. She nodded gratefully, and the minister began to speak in a voice that carried across the suddenly hushed square. Almighty God, we ask for your mercy and forgiveness for all our sins. Grant peace to those who suffer, strength to those who are afraid, and justice for those who seek truth. As the prayer continued, Jake made his final preparations. He loosened his gun in its holster, checked that his horse was positioned correctly, and mentally rehearsed every step of what he was about to do. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to correct mistakes. Either his plan would work, or both he and Clara would likely be dead within the next few minutes. The executioner stepped forward with the noose, preparing to place it around Clara's neck. The crowd held its breath, sensing that the moment of execution was at hand. Judge Hartwell raised his hand, ready to give the final signal that would end Clara Whitmore's life. It was then that Jake Morrison made his choice. With deliberate slowness, he reached up and unpinned the badge from his shirt, the metal catching the sunlight. One last time before he let it fall to the dusty ground at his feet. The metallic ping of Jake's badge hitting the dusty ground cut through the morning air like a gunshot. For a heartbeat, the entire town square fell silent, every eye turning toward the man who had just thrown away his career and his future with a single gesture. Sheriff Hutchinson's face went white with shock, then red with rage as he realized what Jake was about to do. Jake drew his gun in one fluid motion, the weapon appearing in his hand as if by magic. His voice carried across the square with the authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. Step away from the woman. All of you. The crowd erupted into chaos. Women screamed and grabbed their children. Men shouted and pushed toward the exits. And the carefully organized execution turned into a stampede of panicked citizens. But Jake's focus remained fixed on the gallows platform where Clara stood frozen, the noose still in the executioner's hands. "Morrison!" Hutchinson bellowed, his own gun clearing leather. "Have you lost your mind?" "Maybe I have," Jake called back, his weapon trained on the sheriff while his eyes scanned for other threats. "But I won't stand by and watch an innocent woman hang for crime she didn't commit." Deputy McCarty reached for his sidearm, but Jake's gun swung toward him with deadly precision. "I wouldn't if I were you, Billy. You know I'm faster than you are, and I've got nothing to lose anymore." McCarty's hand froze above his holster, uncertainty flickering across his young face. He'd seen Jake in action before, had witnessed the deputy's legendary speed and accuracy with a gun. This wasn't a bluff or a desperate gamble. This was a man prepared to kill anyone who stood in his way. Judge Hartwell stumbled backward from his platform, his formal robes tangling around his legs. "This is madness. Deputies, arrest this man for interfering with lawful execution. The only madness here is hanging an innocent woman." Jake shouted back, never taking his eyes off the men with guns. "Clara Whitmore didn't kill Theodore Blackwood, and every one of you knows it. The executioner, a hired stranger with no loyalty to anyone in Millbrook, had backed away from Clara the moment Jake drew his weapon. He'd been paid to hang a condemned prisoner, not to get shot in a gunfight between local lawmen. Without the noose around her neck, Clara stood alone on the platform. Her shackled hands pressed against her chest as she watched the confrontation unfold. "You're throwing your life away for nothing, Jake," Hutchinson called out, his voice strained with anger and desperation. The sheriff had his own gun drawn but couldn't get a clear shot with so many people still milling around in panic. "She's guilty. The jury said so. The jury was bought and paid for, just like you were." Jake's accusation rang across the square like a church bell. How much did it cost Blackwood's friends to make sure Clara took the blame? How much was her life worth to you? Several members of the crowd had stopped their flight to listen to the exchange, drawn by the explosive accusations Jake was making. Murmurs began to spread among them as people started to question what they thought they knew about the case. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, the mayor's wife, pushed through the crowd toward the platform. Her face was pale but determined as she called out in a clear voice that carried across the square. "He's right. Clara was with me the night Blackwood died. She was altering my dress for the church social." This revelation sent shockwaves through the remaining crowd. Mrs. Pemberton was one of the most respected women in Millbrook, wife of the mayor and pillar of the community. Her word carried weight that couldn't be easily dismissed. "Eleanor, stay out of this," Judge Hartwell commanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he realized that his carefully constructed case was beginning to unravel in front of the entire town. "I will not stay out of it," Mrs. Pemberton shot back, her voice ringing with moral authority. "I kept silent because my husband told me to, because he said it would be better for everyone if we didn't interfere. But I cannot watch an innocent woman die for my cowardice." More voices began to rise from the crowd. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, stepped forward with his hat in his hands. "I saw Clara at Henderson's store that evening, buying thread for Mrs. Pemberton's dress. Had to be near 8 o'clock, which means she couldn't have been at Blackwood's place when he was killed." Old Doc Matthews pushed through the crowd, his medical bag clutched in his arthritic hands. The wound pattern on Blackwood's body was all wrong for a woman Clara's size to have made. Knife went in at an upward angle, like someone taller had done it. "I tried to tell the sheriff, but he wouldn't listen." Sheriff Hutchinson's face was now crimson with rage and embarrassment. His carefully orchestrated frame-up was collapsing before his eyes, and he knew that his own involvement would soon be exposed. Desperate men do desperate things, and Hutchinson was nothing if not desperate. "Enough of this nonsense," the sheriff roared, swinging his gun toward Clara on the platform. "Guilty or innocent, she's going to hang today." But Jake had anticipated this move. His own weapon fired first, the bullet striking Hutchinson's gun hand and sending the sheriff's weapon spinning away into the crowd. Hutchinson screamed and clutched, his wounded hand to his chest, blood seeping between his fingers. The gunshot galvanized Jake into action. He sprinted toward the gallows platform, his long legs carrying him across the square in seconds. Behind him he could hear Deputy Lawson shouting orders and the sound of running feet as men loyal to the sheriff tried to organize a response. Jake leaped onto the platform, just as Deputy McCarty appeared from the other side, having circled around. Through the crowd, the two men faced each other across the wooden planks, their guns drawn and ready. Clara stood between them, her eyes wide with terror as she realized she might be shot in the crossfire. "Don't do this, Billy," Jake said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "You know I'm right about this. Clara's innocent, and you know it." McCarty's young face was twisted with uncertainty and fear. He'd always looked up to Jake as a mentor and friend, but now he was being forced to choose between loyalty to his fellow deputy and obedience to his corrupt superiors. "I got orders, Jake," McCarty said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sheriff says she hangs, then she hangs." "Sometimes a man has to choose between following orders and doing what's right," Jake replied. "This is one of those times, Billy. Choose carefully. Because you'll have to live with whatever decision you make for the rest of your life. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Then, slowly, Billy McCarty lowered his weapon and stepped aside. I can't do it, Jake. I can't shoot you, and I can't watch an innocent woman die. Jake nodded with relief and gratitude. You're a good man, Billy. Better than the rest of us. But their moment of understanding was shattered by the crack of a rifle from somewhere in the crowd. The bullet whined past Jake's head, close enough that he could feel the wind of its passage. More shots followed as Hutchinson's supporters opened fire from concealed positions around the square. Get down! Jake shouted, grabbing Clara and pulling her toward the limited cover provided by the gallows' wooden frame. The heavy timbers offered some protection, but Jake knew they couldn't stay there long. More men would be arriving soon, and they would be surrounded and overwhelmed. The keys! Clara gasped, holding up her shackled hands. I can't run like this. Jake looked around desperately for something to break the chains, his mind racing as bullets continued to fly around them. Then he spotted the executioner's bag of tools near the trapdoor. Among the grim implements was a heavy hammer used for last-minute repairs to the gallows. He grabbed the hammer and motioned for Clara to brace her hands against the wooden beam. Hold still, he commanded, raising the tool above his head. Hammer came down with tremendous force, striking the chain between Clara's wrists. The old iron parted with a sharp crack, freeing her hands even though the shackles remained locked around her wrists. A second blow freed her ankles, giving her the mobility she needed to escape. Can you ride? Jake asked, helping her to her feet. Better than I can sew, Clara replied with a grim smile that reminded Jake why he'd fallen for her in the first place. They made their break for the edge of the platform, Jake's gun covering their retreat as they jumped down into the crowd. People scattered before them, most of the citizens now openly supportive of their escape. The tide of public opinion had turned decisively against the sheriff and his corrupt allies. Jake led Clara through the maze of panicked townspeople toward Henderson's Mercantile, where he'd arranged for their escape horses to wait. Behind them, he could hear Hutchinson screaming orders despite his wounded hand, rallying his remaining supporters for pursuit. There! Jake pointed toward the two horses tied behind the store. The Bay Mare's yours. She's fast and sure-footed. They reached the horses just as Deputy Lawson and 3 other men rounded the corner of the building, their weapons drawn and ready. Jake spun to face them, his gun appearing in his hand with practiced ease. That's far enough, Lawson, Jake called. Out. This doesn't have to get any bloodier than it already has. Frank Lawson was an older man, a career lawman who had served faithfully under 3 different sheriffs. Unlike Hutchinson, he had a reputation for honesty and fairness, which made him a dangerous opponent for Jake's plans. You know I can't let you ride out of here, Jake, Lawson said, his voice heavy with regret. You've broken the law, interfered with a legal execution. I got a duty to stop you. Your duty is to justice, Frank, not to corrupt sheriffs and bought judges. Jake replied, never taking his eyes off the deputy. Clara Whitmore is innocent, and you know it. Are you really going to shoot me to protect the men who framed her? Lawson's weathered face showed the internal struggle he was fighting. He'd served the law faithfully for 20 years, but he'd also seen enough corruption and injustice to recognize it when it started him in the face. Maybe she is innocent, Lawson admitted, but that's not for me to decide. There are proper channels, legal appeals, ways to handle this that don't involve gunfights in the town square. Those proper channels failed her, Jake said, his voice filled with bitter conviction. The system failed her, Frank. When the system fails, sometimes good men have to step outside it to do what's right. Clara had been listening to the exchange while untying the horses, but now she stepped forward, her voice clear and strong despite everything she'd been through. Deputy Lawson, she said, addressing the older man directly. I didn't kill Theodore Blackwood. I was never even in his house that night. Someone murdered him and made it look like I did it, and if I hang today, the real killer goes free. Is that the justice you want to serve?" Lawson looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the cold-blooded killer described in the trial, but a frightened young woman fighting for her life. His gun hand wavered slightly as doubt crept into his mind. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the standoff. More of Hutchinson's men were arriving, their voices raised in anger and bloodlust. Soon Jake and Clara would be surrounded, and any chance of escape would be lost. "Time's up, Frank," Jake said quietly. "What's it going to be?" Deputy Frank Lawson stared into Jake's eyes for what felt like an eternity, the weight of 2 decades of law enforcement pressing down on his shoulders. The sound of approaching riders grew louder, their angry shouts echoing off the buildings around Henderson's Mercantile. In moments, they would be surrounded by men who cared nothing for justice, only for maintaining the corrupt system that had condemned an innocent woman. "Frank," Jake said quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "In 20 years of wearing a badge, how many times have you seen the innocent suffer while the guilty walk free? How many times have you had to look the other way because it was easier than fighting the system?" Lawson's grip on his weapon loosened almost imperceptibly. The lines around his eyes deepened as memories flooded back, cases where evidence had mysteriously disappeared, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories, verdicts that made a mockery of everything he'd sworn to uphold. "Too many times," Lawson admitted, his voice barely audible above the approaching thunder of hoofbeats. "Then don't let it happen again," Clara said, stepping closer to the veteran deputy. "Please, I have no one else to speak for me, no family with money or influence. If you don't help us, I'll die for someone else's crime, and the real killer will never face justice." The first of Hutchinson's reinforcements rounded the corner of the building. 3 rough-looking men Jake recognized as ranch hands from the Double Eagle spread, men who owed their jobs to connections with the sheriffs, political allies. Their leader, a scarred gunfighter named Dutch Keller, raised his rifle the moment he spotted the group behind the Mercantile. "There they are!" Keller shouted, his voice harsh from years of tobacco and whiskey. "Kill Morrison and bring the woman back." Frank Lawson made his choice in that instant. Instead of turning his gun on Jake and Clara, he spun to face the approaching riders, his weapon barking twice in rapid succession. Keller's rifle flew from his hands as one bullet shattered the stock, while the second sent his horse rearing. In panic, "Go!" Lawson shouted to Jake and Clara. "Get out of here before more of them arrive." Jake needed no further encouragement. He boosted Clara onto the Baymar, then swung into the saddle of his own mount, a powerful black gelding he'd chosen for its speed and endurance. The horses were fresh and ready, having been fed and watered while they waited. "This way," Jake called, spurring his horse toward the narrow alley that ran between the Mercantile and the barber shop. It was barely wide enough for 2 horses to pass, but it would lead them to the creek that ran behind the town, where they could water their mounts and plan their next move. Behind them, gunfire erupted as Lawson held off Keller's men, buying precious time for their escape. The veteran deputy had thrown away his own career and possibly his life to give them this chance, and Jake was determined not to waste it. They galloped through the alley at breakneck speed, Clara proving her earlier boast about her riding ability, as she guided her mare with skill and confidence. The narrow passage amplified the sound of their horses' hooves, creating a thunderous echo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings around them. "Pemberton," Jake said grimly, "this isn't just a normal posse hunting fugitives. This is a carefully planned manhunt, organized by someone who has a lot to lose if we're captured alive." A new voice spoke from the doorway behind them, cold and threatening. Well, look what we have here." Jake and Clara spun around to find Dutch Keller standing in the entrance, his rifle trained on them both. Behind him, 2 other men appeared, their own weapons drawn and ready. Somehow, they'd approached the cabin without making a sound, probably using the noise of Jake and Clara's conversation to mask their approach. "Dutch," Jake acknowledged, his own gun still in his hand but pointed at the floor. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Keller grinned, revealing yellowed teeth stained with tobacco. "Mayor Pemberton's offering $1,000 for the woman, dead or alive. 500 for you, Morrison, though he'd prefer you dead. Seems you've caused him quite a bit of trouble." "Not as much trouble as he's caused himself," Jake replied, his mind racing through possible escape options. The cabin had only one door, and there were 3 armed men blocking it. The windows were too small to climb through quickly, and the walls were too thick to shoot through effectively. "That's enough talking," Keller said, his tone turning businesslike. "Drop your weapons, and put your hands where we can see them. We've got a long ride back to town, and the mayor's anxious to see his guests." Clara stepped closer to Jake, her hand moving toward the small derringer she'd taken from her boarding house room before her arrest. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it might provide the distraction they needed to escape. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, lady," one of Keller's companions warned, apparently noticing her movement. "We got orders to bring you in, but nobody said you had to be walking when we got there." Jake made his decision. "Clara," he said quietly, "when I move, you dive behind that table and stay down." Before anyone could react, Jake threw himself sideways, his gun coming up as he moved. His first shot took Keller in the shoulder, spinning the gunfighter around and sending his rifle clattering across the floor. Jake's second shot shattered the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling, plunging the cabin into relative darkness as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows at sharp angles. Clara followed Jake's instructions, diving behind the overturned table as gunfire erupted throughout the small space. Wood splinters flew as bullets struck the walls and furniture, and the air filled with acrid gun smoke that made breathing difficult. Jake rolled behind the iron stove, using it for cover as he returned fire. One of Keller's men cried out and stumbled backward through the doorway, clutching his leg where Jake's bullet had found its mark. "The window!" Jake shouted to Clara over the roar of gunfire. "Can you reach it?" Clara looked toward the small window on the side wall of the cabin. It was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but it might be their only chance of escape. She began crawling across the floor, staying low to avoid the bullets that continued to fly overhead. Keller, wounded but still dangerous, had retrieved his rifle and was trying to get a clear shot at Jake's position behind the stove. "You're only making this harder on yourselves," he called out. "Give up now, and maybe you'll live long enough to see a trial. The only trial we'll see is at the end of a rope." Jake shot back, punctuating his words with another shot that sent Keller diving for cover. Clara reached the window and began working frantically to open the warped wooden frame. Years of weather and neglect had swollen the wood, making it nearly impossible to move. She could hear Jake's gun running low on ammunition, the intervals between his shots growing longer as he tried to conserve his remaining bullets. Finally, the window frame gave way with a loud crack, opening just wide enough for Clara to squeeze through. "Jake," she called. "I'm going for the horses. Go." Jake replied, providing covering fire as Clara disappeared through the window. "I'll be right behind you." But as Jake prepared to make his own escape, he heard the distinctive sound of more riders approaching the cabin. Their pursuers had found them, and escape was about to become much more difficult. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats grew louder as Jake realized their situation had gone from desperate to impossible. Through the cabin's front window, he could see dust clouds rising. From multiple directions, at least a dozen riders converging on their position. Clara had made it outside through the side window, but now they were both trapped in an increasingly tightening noose. Jake's ammunition was running dangerously low. He had perhaps 3 shots left in his pistol and no spare rounds in his belt. Dutch Keller and his remaining companion had taken cover outside the cabin, using the doorframe and wall corners to shield themselves while they waited for reinforcements to arrive. "Morrison!" Keller's voice carried clearly through the gun smoke. "You hear those horses? That's Mayor Pemberton himself, coming with 20 armed men. You got about 2 minutes to surrender before this becomes a massacre." Jake peered through a gap in the wooden wall, trying to assess their tactical situation. The approaching riders were spreading out to surround the cabin, cutting off any possible escape routes. Clara was somewhere outside, hopefully hidden among the rocks and scrub brush that dotted the landscape. Around the line shack, the sound of breaking glass from the back of the cabin told Jake that more men were trying to enter through the rear window. Soon he would be caught in crossfire with no way out. But surrender meant certain death, not a trial, not even a lynching, but summary execution disguised as resisting arrest. Then he heard Clara's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling from somewhere behind the cabin. "Jake, the horses are loose. I'm going to create a distraction." Before Jake could call out a warning, he heard the sharp crack of Clara's derringer, followed immediately by a man's scream of pain and the sound of a horse rearing in panic. Whatever she was doing, it was working several of the approaching riders began shouting in confusion as their mounts spooked and scattered. Jake seized the opportunity. He burst through the cabin's front door, his remaining bullets driving Keller and his companion back into cover. The gunfighter's wounded shoulder was bleeding heavily, slowing his movements and affecting his aim. Jake's first shot struck the doorframe inches from Keller's head, sending splinters flying. "There he is!" Someone shouted from the left side of the cabin. "Get him!" Jake dove behind a large boulder just as a fusillade of rifle fire erupted from multiple positions. Bullets sparked off the rock and whined away into the distance, while others thudded into the ground around his position. He was pinned down, but at least he was out of the death trap the cabin had become. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting men, Jake caught glimpses of Clara moving among the scattered horses. She had somehow managed to spook most of the posse's mounts, sending them galloping away across the landscape and leaving many of the pursuers on foot. It was a brilliant tactical move that had temporarily evened the odds. A new voice cut through the din cold, authoritative and filled with barely controlled rage. "Cease fire, I want them alive." Jake recognized the voice immediately. Mayor Richard Pemberton had arrived, and he was taking personal command of the manhunt. This confirmed what Jake had suspected. This wasn't just law enforcement pursuing escaped fugitives. This was a man fighting desperately to protect himself from exposure. "Morrison!" Pemberton called out, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "I know you can hear me. I'm prepared to make you an offer." Jake remained silent, using the momentary lull in gunfire to check his position and look for Clara. He spotted her crouched behind a fallen log about 50 yards away, her derringer ready and her eyes alert for danger. "I know what the woman told you," Pemberton continued, "about seeing me that night. But think about it. Morrison, who's going to believe the word of a condemned murderess and a rogue deputy against the mayor of Millbrook?" The mayor's words confirmed Clara's story beyond any doubt. Pemberton was essentially confessing to the murder while simultaneously threatening them with the futility of trying to expose him. "Even if you somehow managed to escape and spread your story," Pemberton went on, "who would listen? I have friends in the territorial government, contacts in the federal marshal's office. Your word against mine? You'd be laughed out of every courtroom in the territory." Jake finally responded, his voice carrying his own note of authority. "Maybe so, Pemberton. But guilty men don't usually organize manhunts with 20 armed riders. Your reaction to our escape tells its own story." A long silence followed, broken only by the distant sound of spooked horses and the nervous shuffling of men taking cover around the cabin. Jake could almost feel Pemberton weighing his options, calculating the risks of letting them live against the dangers of killing them outright. "Here's my final offer," Pemberton called out eventually. "Surrender now, and I guarantee you'll live long enough to see a proper trial. The woman can have her day in court, present her evidence, make her case to a jury. That's more than you'll get if you keep fighting." Jake almost laughed at the absurdity of the offer. A trial presided over by Judge Hartwell, with prosecutors chosen by Pemberton himself, and a jury selected from men who owed their livelihoods to the mayor's political machine. It would be nothing more than an elaborate execution disguised as due process. "What about Mrs. Pemberton?" Jake called back, playing for time while he tried to think of a way out of their predicament. "Does your wife know what kind of man she married? Does she know her husband is a murderer?" The silence that followed was different from before, deeper, more ominous. When Pemberton spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of reasonableness. "Eleanor knows nothing, and she never will. Kill them both. Make it look like they resisted arrest." The order galvanized the men surrounding the cabin into action. Rifle fire erupted from multiple positions as Pemberton's hired guns began their final assault. Jake pressed himself against the boulder as bullets struck all around him, sending chips of stone flying and filling the air with dust and debris. But as the gunfight intensified, Jake began to notice something strange. Not all the shots were aimed at him and Clara. Some of the muzzle flashes he could see were pointing in different directions, and he could hear men shouting in confusion and anger rather than the coordinated commands of an organized attack. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire!" The voice belonged to Deputy Frank Lawson, and it was coming from the direction of the main trail. "This is Deputy Lawson. I'm ordering all of you to stand down." Jake risked a look around the edge of his boulder and saw an astonishing sight. Lawson was riding hard toward the cabin, followed by at least a dozen men Jake recognized as honest citizens of Millbrook farmers, shopkeepers, and ranch hands who had no connection to Pemberton's political machine. But even more surprising was the woman riding beside Lawson on a borrowed horse, her dress torn and her face streaked with dust, but her expression determined and resolute. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton had come to face her husband. "Richard," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "Richard, I know what you did. I know about Theodore Blackwood." The gunfire began to taper off as men on both sides became confused about who they were supposed to be shooting at. Pemberton's hired guns looked uncertainty between their employer and the new arrivals, while some of the legitimate posse members began to lower their weapons entirely. "Eleanor, get out of here!" Pemberton shouted, his voice cracking with panic and rage. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me more than anyone," she replied, dismounting from her horse and walking boldly toward the cabin despite the scattered gunfire still echoing around them. "Clara Whitmore nearly died for your crimes. I won't let an innocent woman's blood be on my hands." Jake used the confusion to break cover, sprinting toward Clara's position behind the fallen log. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet, but most of the shooters seemed reluctant to fire with so many people moving around the battlefield. "Are you hurt?" Jake asked as he dove behind the log beside Clara. "Just scraped up," she replied, checking her derringer to see if she had any shots left. "What's happening? Who are all those people with Deputy Lawson?" "Looks like Mrs. Pemberton brought reinforcements," Jake said, hardly believing what he was seeing. "Honest citizens who want to hear the truth." Mrs. Pemberton had reached the center of the clearing now, standing tall and defiant despite the chaos around her. Her voice carried with the authority of a woman who had finally found her moral courage. "I heard the argument," she announced, addressing not just her husband but everyone within earshot. "The night Theodore Blackwood died, I heard you arguing with him in our parlor. He was threatening to expose your land deals, and you said you'd kill him before you'd let him ruin you." "Eleanor, you don't know what you're saying," Pemberton called back, but his voice lacked conviction. You're upset, confused, I know. Exactly what I'm saying, she cut him off. I know why you framed Clara. Because she was convenient, because she was vulnerable, because you thought no one would care enough to fight for her. Deputy Lawson had dismounted and was walking carefully toward the cabin, his hands visible and empty of weapons. Behind him, the citizens he'd brought were spreading out, creating a buffer between Pemberton's hired guns and Jake and Clara. Mayor Pemberton, Lawson called out formally. I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Theodore Blackwood and the conspiracy to commit judicial murder against Clara Whitmore. You have no authority here, Lawson. Pemberton snarled back. I am the duly elected mayor of this town, and I order you to arrest those fugitives. Your authority doesn't extend to murder, Lawson replied calmly. And it certainly doesn't extend to ordering the execution of innocent people. The standoff continued for several tense moments, with armed men on both sides uncertain about who they should be following. Then Dutch Keller, still bleeding from his wounded shoulder, made the decision for everyone. I ain't getting killed for no politician's dirty secrets, he announced, dropping his rifle and raising his hands. Mayor, you can keep your blood money. I'm done. His surrender broke the spell that had held the other hired guns. One by one, they began laying down their weapons and stepping away from their positions. Some melted away into the countryside, while others simply stood with their hands raised, waiting to see what would happen next. Pemberton found himself increasingly isolated, his supporters abandoning him as the truth of his situation became clear. But rather than surrender, he seemed to be growing more desperate and dangerous with each passing moment. You think this changes anything? He screamed, his composure finally cracking completely. You think you can destroy everything I've built? I'll see this whole town burn before I let that happen. Jake saw the mayor reaching for something inside his coat and realized with horror what was about to happen. Pemberton wasn't carrying just a pistol. He was reaching for a stick of dynamite, the kind used for clearing stumps and building railroad cuts. Everyone get down, Jake shouted, rising from behind the log with his gun drawn. He's got explosives. The warning came almost too late. Pemberton struck a match and held it toward the fuse of the dynamite stick, his face twisted with rage and madness. In that moment, he looked like a man who had lost everything and was determined to take as many people with him as possible. Jake's last bullet flew true, striking Pemberton in the wrist and sending the dynamite flying through the air. Before the fuse could fully ignite, the stick landed harmlessly in the dirt several yards away, its fuse sputtering out before it could reach the explosive. The mayor fell to his knees, clutching his shattered wrist and staring in disbelief at the blood flowing between his fingers. His grand scheme to eliminate his accusers had failed, and now he faced not just exposure, but charges of attempted mass murder. Mrs. Pemberton approached her wounded husband slowly, her face a mask of grief and disappointment. "Oh, Richard," she said softly, "what have you become?" Deputy Lawson moved quickly to secure the scene, ordering Pemberton's remaining supporters to throw down their weapons and submit to arrest. The honest citizens who had followed him began helping to round up the hired guns and restore order to the chaotic situation. Clara emerged from behind the log, her legs shaky from the adrenaline and relief of their narrow escape. Jake moved to support her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as they watched the dramatic conclusion of their ordeal. "Is it over?" Clara asked, hardly daring to believe that their nightmare might finally be ending. "It's over," Jake confirmed, though he knew that the legal proceedings ahead would be complex and potentially dangerous. "But we've got witnesses now, and we've got the truth. That's more than we had this morning." As the dust settled around the line shack, Jake Morrison and Clara Whitmore faced an uncertain future. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, they faced it together, and they faced it with hope. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic confrontation at the line shack, and Millbrook was still reeling from the revelations that had shattered its political establishment. Jake Morrison stood at the window of the hotel room where Clara was recovering, watching the bustle of activity in the street below as federal marshals continued their investigation into the corruption that had nearly cost an innocent woman her life. The territorial governor had dispatched a team of investigators within days of receiving Deputy Lawson's detailed report, and their findings had exceeded everyone's worst expectations. Mayor Pemberton's illegal land deal stretched back years and involved prominent figures throughout the territory. The scandal had reached all the way to Washington, where congressional committees were now demanding answers about how such widespread corruption had been allowed to flourish. Clara sat propped up in bed, her physical injuries from their harrowing escape finally beginning to heal. But Jake could see that the emotional wounds would take much longer to mend. She had been vindicated completely. Pemberton's confession, witnessed by dozens of people, had cleared her name beyond any doubt. Yet the trauma of facing death for a crime she didn't commit had left invisible scars that would take time to heal. "Doctor Matthews says I can leave the hotel tomorrow," Clara said, closing the book she'd been reading. "Though I'm not sure where I'll go." Jake turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "Actually, I've been meaning to talk to you about that. I received an interesting visitor this morning while you were sleeping." "Oh?" Clara raised an eyebrow, curious despite her exhaustion. "Federal Marshal William Crawford. Seems the territorial government is looking for honest lawmen to help clean up the mess that Pemberton and his cronies left behind. They offered me the position of sheriff here in Millbrook, with full authority to rebuild the department from the ground up." Clara's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Jake, that's wonderful. You'd be perfect for the job. This town needs someone they can trust, someone who proved he'd stand up for what's right, even when it cost him everything." "There's just one condition," Jake said, moving closer to her bedside. "I told Marshal Crawford I'd only take the job if I had a deputy I could trust completely. Someone who had proven their courage under fire and their commitment to justice." Clara stared at him in amazement. "You mean ... me? But Jake, I'm not a lawwoman, I'm a seamstress." "You're a lot more than that," Jake replied firmly. "You survived a frame-up that would have broken most people. You kept your head during a gunfight and helped save both our lives. And you had the courage to tell the truth even when you knew it might get you killed." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a silver badge, its surface gleaming in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the hotel window. "Clara Whitmore, would you do me the honor of serving as my deputy sheriff?" Tears began to flow down Clara's cheeks as she stared at the badge. After everything she'd been through, the arrest, the trial, the near execution, the desperate flight across the countryside, she was being offered not just vindication, but a chance to help ensure that what happened to her would never happen to anyone else. "Jake," she whispered, reaching out to touch the badge with trembling fingers, "are you sure about this? People will talk. A woman deputy sheriff is almost unheard of in these parts." "Let them talk," Jake said with a grin. "After what we've been through together, I think we can handle a few gossips and complainers." Clara took the badge and held it up to catch the light, marveling at how much her life had changed in such a short time. Just weeks ago, she had been facing death for a crime she didn't commit. Now she was being offered a chance to wear a badge and uphold the law alongside the man who had risked everything to save her. "There's something else," Jake continued, his voice becoming more serious. "Marshal Crawford told me about some of the other investigations that are ongoing. It seems Pemberton's corruption wasn't limited to Millbrook. There are similar situations in towns throughout the territory, and they're going to need experienced people to help sort them out." "You mean we might not be staying here permanently?" Clara asked. "Not necessarily." The marshal mentioned the possibility of us working as a team, traveling to different communities that need help rebuilding their law enforcement after corruption scandals. We'd be troubleshooters, going wherever honest lawmen are needed most. Clara considered this prospect with growing excitement. The idea of traveling throughout the territory, helping to establish justice in communities that had been failed by corrupt officials, appealed to her sense of purpose. After being a victim of injustice herself, she felt called to help prevent others from suffering the same fate. It would be dangerous work, Jake warned. We'd be dealing with powerful people who have a lot to lose if their crimes are exposed. Not everyone will welcome us with open arms. I understand the risks, Clara replied, pinning the deputy's badge to her nightgown with steady hands. But after what we've been through, I can't imagine going back to just sewing dresses and pretending the world is a safe and fair place. I want to make a difference, Jake. I want to help people who can't help themselves. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his gun before he recognized the gentle tapping as belonging to Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton. The mayor's widow had visited Clara several times during her recovery, seeking some form of absolution for her husband's crimes. "Come in, Mrs. Pemberton," Clara called out, quickly pulling a shawl over her shoulders to cover the badge. Eleanor Pemberton entered the room carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Her face still bore the weight of her husband's betrayal, but she held herself with a dignity that had only grown stronger since the truth came to light. "I brought you some of Mrs. Murphy's chicken soup," she said, setting the basket on the table beside Clara's bed. "She insisted that nothing else would help you regain your strength properly." "That's very kind of both of you," Clara replied warmly. Despite everything that had happened, she felt no animosity toward Mrs. Pemberton, who had ultimately proven herself to be a woman of courage and integrity. "I also wanted to let you know that the town council met this morning," Mrs. Pemberton continued. "They voted unanimously to establish a reward fund for you, Miss Whitmore. $5,000 as compensation for what you suffered due to my husband's actions." Clara's eyes widened at the substantial sum. $5,000 represented more money than she could have earned in years of sewing, enough to secure her future regardless of what she chose to do with her life. "Mrs. Pemberton, that's incredibly generous, but I'm not sure I can accept such a large amount," Clara said. "I didn't do anything heroic. I was just trying to survive." "Survival in the face of such injustice is heroic enough," Mrs. Pemberton replied firmly, "and the money comes with no strings attached. You're free to use it however you see fit, to start a new life wherever you choose, or to stay here in Millbrook if you prefer." Jake and Clara exchanged meaningful glances. The reward money would give them the financial security they needed to take on the challenging work that Marshal Crawford had described. They could afford to travel between assignments, maintain their equipment, and help the communities they served without worrying about their own survival. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Pemberton added, her voice becoming more hesitant. "The people of Millbrook want to do something to honor what you both did. They're planning a ceremony for next Sunday after church services. Nothing too elaborate. Just a chance for the community to express their gratitude and officially welcome you back as respected citizens." Clara felt tears threatening again. The same people who had gathered to watch her execution were now planning to honor her courage. It was a powerful reminder of how quickly public opinion could change when the truth finally came to light. "We'd be honored to attend," Jake said, speaking for both of them. "This community has been through a lot, and healing will take time. If our presence can help with that process, then we're happy to participate." After Mrs. Pemberton left, Jake and Clara spent the rest of the afternoon planning their future together. They discussed the challenges they would face as law enforcement partners, the skills Clara would need to develop, and the type of cases they might encounter in their travels throughout the territory. "There's something I need to ask you," Jake said as the conversation began to wind down. "This partnership we're talking about, is it strictly professional? Or is there room for something more personal as well?" Clara felt her cheeks warm at the directness of his question. Throughout their ordeal, she had been acutely aware of Jake's feelings for her, and her own emotions had grown deeper with each act of courage and sacrifice he had made on her behalf. "Jake Morrison," she said with a smile that lit up her entire face, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I suppose I am," Jake replied, his own smile matching hers. "Though I have to warn you, being married to a lawman isn't easy. There will be long separations, dangerous assignments, and people who want to hurt us because of the work we do." "And I have to warn you," Clara countered, "that being married to a woman deputy sheriff will bring its own challenges. People will question your judgment, criticize your choice of partner, and probably blame me for any failures in your career. Are you willing to face those challenges together?" Jake asked, reaching out to take her hand. "I can't think of anyone I'd rather face them with," Clara replied, intertwining her fingers with his dot as the sun set over Millbrook, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Jake Morrison and Clara Whitmore began planning a future that neither of them could have imagined just a month earlier. They had survived corruption, violence, and injustice, and their love had been forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. The next morning brought news that would shape the next phase of their lives. Marshal Crawford arrived with orders from the territorial governor, along with reports of trouble in 3 different communities that needed immediate attention from experienced investigators. "Sheriff Morrison," the marshal said, using Jake's new title for the first time, "how quickly can you and Deputy Whitmore be ready to travel? We've got a situation developing in Cedar Falls that needs immediate attention. Seems their entire city government has disappeared overnight, along with most of the money in the town treasury." Jake looked at Clara, who was already reaching for her gun belt and badge. The seamstress who had been dragged through the streets in chains was gone, replaced by a determined lawwoman ready to fight for justice wherever it was needed. "We can be ready within the hour, Marshal," Jake replied. "Just point us in the right direction." As they prepared for their first official assignment together, Clara reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything: her quiet life, her anonymity, her sense of safety in the world. But in losing those things, she had found something far more valuable: a purpose worth fighting for and a partner worth standing beside through whatever challenges lay ahead. The woman who had once been condemned to hang for another man's crime was now riding out to protect the innocent and uphold the law. And beside her rode the man who had thrown away his badge to save her life, only to earn it back through courage and determination. Together, they would face whatever the frontier threw at them, knowing that their love had been tested in the crucible of injustice and had emerged stronger than ever. The chains that had once bound Clara in disgrace had been broken, replaced by bonds of love and partnership that no corrupt official or hired gun could ever sever. Their story had begun with betrayal and false accusations, but it would continue with hope, justice, and the unshakable conviction that even in the harshest corners of the frontier, truth and righteousness could prevail when good people were willing to fight for them. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as Jake Morrison and Clara Whitmore rode into Cedar Falls, their badges gleaming in the early sunlight and their eyes alert for signs of the trouble that had brought them here. 3 months had passed since their first assignment together, and they had already earned a reputation throughout the territory as lawmen who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or turned away from the truth. Cedar Falls should have been bustling with activity for a town of its size, but the streets were eerily quiet. Shops that should have been opening for business remained shuttered, and the few people they saw hurried along with their heads down, avoiding eye contact with the 2 strangers who had ridden into their community. "Something's not right here," Clara observed, her hand resting casually on the butt of her gun. "This place feels like a town under siege." Jake nodded, his experienced eyes taking in the details that spoke of fear and oppression. Broken windows that hadn't been repaired, buildings with boarded-up doorways, and most tellingly, the absence of children playing in the streets or yards. In a healthy frontier community, children were everywhere during daylight hours, but Cedar Falls seemed devoid of young voices and laughter. They reined in their horses in front of what had once been the town hall, a two-story brick building that now showed signs of recent violence. Bullet holes poked the facade, and scorch marks around the main entrance suggested that someone had tried to burn the building down. Marshal Crawford said the entire city government disappeared, Jake said, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post. But it looks like they didn't go quietly. A timid voice spoke from the shadows of a nearby alley. You folks law officers? Jake and Clara turned to see an elderly man peering at them from behind a stack of empty crates. His clothes were worn, but clean, and his eyes held the wariness of someone who had seen too much violence and betrayal. We are, Clara replied gently, recognizing the man's fear and trying to put him at ease. I'm Deputy Sheriff Whitmore, and this is Sheriff Morrison. We're here to investigate what happened to your town government. The old man stepped more fully into view, though he continued to glance nervously up and down the street. Name's Charlie Duggan. I used to be the town clerk before ... He trailed off, shaking his head sadly. Before what, Mr. Duggan? Jake asked, his voice carrying the authority of a lawman but tempered with kindness. Before the Kellerman gang took over, Duggan said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They've been running this town for the past 2 months, ever since they drove out Mayor Harrison and the rest of the council. Clara felt her blood run cold at the mention of the Kellerman name. She and Jake had heard reports of this particular gang throughout their travels. A group of ruthless outlaws led by a man named Silas Kellerman, who specialized in taking over small communities and bleeding them dry before moving on to the next target. Tell us what happened, Jake said, guiding Duggan into the partial shelter of the town hall's covered porch. Start from the beginning. Duggan looked around nervously before beginning his story. It started about 3 months ago. Kellerman and his men rode into town claiming to be cattle buyers. They had money, seemed legitimate, so folks were friendly enough. But then strange things started happening. What kind of strange things? Clara asked. People who asked too many questions about their business started having accidents, Duggan explained. Tom Wilson, who ran the bank, fell down his own stairs and broke his neck. Sheriff Garrett was found dead in his office with a gun in his hand. They said it was suicide, but Tom Garrett was the most optimistic man I ever knew. Jake and Clara exchanged glances. The pattern was familiar from other towns they'd investigated. A criminal organization moving in gradually, eliminating potential opposition through carefully staged accidents before revealing their true nature. When did they drop the pretense? Jake asked. About 2 months ago, Duggan continued. Mayor Harrison called a town meeting to discuss some irregularities in the bank's books. That very night, Kellerman and a dozen armed men surrounded the town hall and announced they were taking over. Said anyone who didn't like it was free to leave, but their property would stay behind. Clara felt a familiar anger building in her chest. It was the same kind of abuse of power that had nearly cost her own life, the strong preying on the weak simply because they could. What happened to Mayor Harrison and the others? She asked. Duggan's face grew even more troubled. They loaded them into wagons and drove them out of town. Said they were being relocated for their own safety. Nobody's seen or heard from them since. Jake processed this information with growing concern. If the missing officials were still alive, they would be key witnesses to Kellerman's crimes. But if they had been murdered, as seemed increasingly likely, then Jake and Clara were dealing with a gang that had already crossed the line into mass killing. How many men does Kellerman have? Jake asked. Hard to say for certain, Duggan replied. Maybe 15 or 20 that I've seen. They've taken over the hotel and the saloon as their headquarters, and they've got guards posted at both ends of town. Clara was already formulating a plan in her mind. 20 armed outlaws represented a significant force, too many for 2 lawmen to confront directly. But their investigation techniques had evolved considerably since their first assignment together, and they had learned that information and strategy could often accomplish what brute force could not. "Mr. Duggan," Clara said, "we're going to need your help to gather intelligence about Kellerman's operation. But first, we need to find a safe place to set up our base of operations. There's an old mine shaft about 2 miles north of town," Duggan suggested. "Been abandoned for years, but it's got fresh water and good cover. Nobody goes up there anymore because of the cave-in that killed 3 miners last year." "Perfect," Jake said. "Can you meet us there after dark? And can you spread the word quietly to other townspeople who might be willing to help? We'll need local knowledge if we're going to succeed." Duggan nodded eagerly, his face showing the first signs of hope they'd seen since arriving in Cedar Falls. "I'll be there, and I'll bring others. Folks have been waiting for someone to stand up to Kellerman. They just needed to know they weren't alone." After Duggan melted back into the shadows, Jake and Clara spent the rest of the day conducting a careful reconnaissance of the town. They posed as travelers seeking supplies and lodging, allowing them to observe Kellerman's men and assess their defenses. The gang had indeed taken over the hotel and saloon, turning them into a fortress-like compound with armed guards and clear fields of fire in all directions. They had also posted sentries at strategic points throughout the town, making it impossible for anyone to enter or leave without being observed. But Jake and Clara also noticed weaknesses in the gang's position. Their confidence had made them careless about certain details, and their contempt for the local population had caused them to underestimate the potential for organized resistance. As darkness fell, they made their way to the abandoned mine shaft, where Charlie Duggan was waiting with 6 other townspeople. The group included Martha Crawford, the schoolteacher, Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's physician, and 4 men who had lost businesses or family members to Kellerman's reign of terror. "Before we start planning any action," Jake addressed the group, "I need to know what you're prepared to do. Fighting Kellerman means risking your lives, and there's no guarantee we'll succeed." "Sheriff," Dr. Hayes spoke up, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation, "Kellerman killed my son when the boy tried to protect his mother from one of the gang members. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to see justice done." The others nodded in agreement, their faces showing the same determination that Jake had seen in countless frontier communities where good people have been pushed too far. Clara stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority she had earned through months of dangerous work. "Then here's what we're going to do. We can't fight them head-on, but we can use their overconfidence against them." She began outlining a plan that was both audacious and carefully calculated. Rather than attempting a direct assault on Kellerman's stronghold, they would systematically undermine his control over the town by exposing the criminal nature of his operation to outside authorities. "Mr. Duggan," Clara continued, "you mentioned that Kellerman has been using the bank for his operations. That means there will be records of his transactions, evidence of money laundering and theft that we can use against him." "The bank's locked up tight," Duggan protested. "Kellerman's got 2 guards on it at all times." "Leave that to us," Jake said confidently. "Clara and I have dealt with similar situations before. The key is creating the right kind of distraction." They spent the next 2 hours working out the details of their plan. It would require precise timing, considerable courage from the townspeople, and more than a little luck. But it offered their best chance of success without triggering a massacre that would devastate the community. The plan they developed was multi-layered and sophisticated. Dr. Hayes would use his medical supplies to create smoke bombs that could provide cover for their operations. Martha Crawford would organize the women and children to evacuate to predetermined safe locations when the action began. The men would coordinate signal fires on the surrounding hills to alert territorial authorities that Cedar Falls was under attack, but the most crucial element of the plan involved Clara infiltrating Kellerman's headquarters to gather intelligence about the gang's operations and the fate of the missing town officials. "It's too dangerous," Jake protested when Clara explained her role. "If they discover who you are, they'll kill you without hesitation." "They won't discover me," Clara replied with quiet confidence. "I'll go in as a woman seeking work at the saloon. Frontier towns are always looking for women to serve drinks and provide entertainment for the customers." Jake remained unconvinced, but he recognized the tactical wisdom of Clara's proposal. She could gather information that would be impossible for him to obtain, and her presence inside Kellerman's stronghold would give them eyes and ears where they needed them most. "Besides," Clara added with a slight smile, "I've had plenty of practice playing roles I wasn't born to. A few months ago, I was pretending to be a condemned murderer. Pretending to be a saloon girl should be considerably easier." The meeting broke up near midnight, with each participant knowing their role in the operation that would begin the following evening. As Jake and Clara prepared to spend the night in the abandoned mine, they reflected on how much their partnership had evolved since those desperate days fleeing across the countryside. "Clara," Jake said as they settled down beside their small campfire, "I need you to know something. If this goes wrong tomorrow night, if we don't make it out of Cedar Falls, I want you to know that these past few months have been the best of my life." Clara moved closer to him, taking his hand in hers. "Jake Morrison, if you think you're getting rid of me that easily, you're sadly mistaken. We've got a job to finish here, and then we've got a wedding to plan." The next evening, as Clara prepared to enter Kellerman's stronghold, she thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a simple seamstress, invisible and unimportant in the grand scheme of frontier life. Now she was a deputy sheriff, about to risk her life to save a community from the same kind of corruption and violence that had nearly destroyed her own life. The woman who had once been dragged through the streets in chains was now walking voluntarily into danger, armed with courage, determination, and the unshakable conviction that justice was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. As she approached the saloon doors, Clara Whitmore smiled grimly. Silas Kellerman and his gang were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are those who have already lost everything once and refuse to let it happen again. Clara straightened her borrowed dress and took a deep breath before pushing through the batwing doors of the Red Moon Saloon. The transformation from deputy sheriff to potential saloon girl was complete. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders. Her clothes were deliberately worn and travel-stained, and she carried herself with the weary resignation of a woman who had few options left in life. The interior of the saloon was thick with tobacco smoke and the stench of unwashed bodies. Rough men sat around card tables, their guns prominently displayed and their eyes constantly scanning for threats or opportunities. At the far end of the room, a man Clara immediately recognized as Silas Kellerman held court from behind a large oak desk that had obviously been stolen from the town hall. Kellerman was a large man with graying hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they looked upon. Scars on his hands and face spoke of a lifetime of violence, and the way his men deferred to him made it clear that his authority was absolute and brutally enforced. "Well, well," Kellerman said as Clara approached his table, his voice carrying the measured tones of an educated man who had chosen a criminal path. "What have we here? A new arrival in our little kingdom?" "I'm looking for work," Clara said, allowing a slight tremor of nervousness into her voice. "I heard you might have a need for someone to serve drinks and keep your customers happy." Kellerman's eyes roamed over her appraisingly, and Clara forced herself to remain still under his scrutiny. She had faced death before, but there was something particularly unsettling about being evaluated like merchandise by a man who clearly viewed human beings as objects to be used and discarded. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Kellerman asked, gesturing for her to come closer. "Rose," Clara replied, using the alias she and Jake had agreed upon. "Rose Thompson. I've been working the mining camps up north, but things got too rough even." "For me, Rose Thompson," Kellerman repeated, as if testing the name. "Well, Rose, you certainly look like you've seen some hard times, but that might work in your favor here. Our customers appreciate a woman with experience." One of Kellerman's lieutenants, a weasel-faced man with a prominent gold tooth, leaned forward with interest. "Boss, maybe we should ask Rose about what she might have seen on her way into town. Travelers sometimes pick up interesting information." Clara's pulse quickened, but she maintained her facade of nervous hope. "I didn't see much of anything unusual. Just passed a couple of riders on the main road. Looked like they might be heading toward the territorial capital." "Riders, you say?" Kellerman's tone sharpened slightly. "What did they look like?" "Man and a woman," Clara replied, sticking close to the truth while misdirecting suspicion. "Well-dressed, good horses." The woman was wearing a traveling dress. "That must have cost more than I make in a year. Probably some rich folks heading to Santa Fe or Denver." Kellerman relaxed slightly, apparently satisfied that the riders Clara described posed no threat to his operation. "Well, Rose, it looks like you've arrived at an opportune time. We're always in need of attractive women to keep our guests entertained. The pay is good, and the work isn't too demanding as long as you keep our customers happy." "What happened to the last girl who worked here?" Clara asked, genuinely curious about the fate of any women who might have fallen into Kellerman's hands. Shadow passed over Kellerman's face, and several of his men shifted uncomfortably. "Let's just say she decided to seek opportunities elsewhere," he said coldly. "I trust you'll be more appreciative of the generous arrangement we're offering." Clara nodded quickly, recognizing the implicit threat in his words. "Of course, Mr. Kellerman. I'm grateful for any work you can give me." "Good. Jimmy here will show you to a room upstairs and explain the house rules. I suggest you listen carefully. We don't tolerate mistakes or disloyalty." The man with the gold tooth, apparently named Jimmy, stood and beckoned for Clara to follow him. As they climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, Clara mentally cataloged everything she observed about the building's layout, the number of armed men, and the locations of potential escape routes. "Here's your room," Jimmy said, opening a door to reveal a small, sparsely furnished space with a single window that looked out onto the alley behind the saloon. "You'll work the evening shift, serving drinks and entertaining customers. The boss gets 60% of your tips, and you get meals and lodging in return." "What about the rules Mr. Kellerman mentioned?" Clara asked. Jimmy's expression grew serious. "Rule 1. What happens in this saloon stays in this saloon. Rule 2. You never ask questions about the boss's business. Rule 3. You never try to leave town without permission. Break any of those rules, and you'll end up like the last girl who worked here." "What happened to her?" Clara pressed, sensing that Jimmy might be more talkative than his boss. Jimmy glanced around nervously before answering. "She got too curious about some papers she found in one of the customers' rooms. Started asking questions about missing people and stolen money. Boss had her taken for a ride out to Eagle Canyon. She ain't coming back." Clara felt sick to her stomach but forced herself to maintain her cover. "I understand. I just want to work and stay out of trouble." "Smart girl," Jimmy said approvingly. "Get yourself cleaned up and come downstairs in an hour. Saturday nights are always busy, and the boss likes his girls to look their best." After Jimmy left, Clara quickly examined her room for anything that might be useful. The window was large enough to climb through if necessary, and the drop to the alley below was manageable. More importantly, she could see across the street to the hotel where Kellerman had established his main headquarters. As the evening progressed, Clara worked her way around the saloon, serving drinks and listening carefully to the conversations around her. The information she gathered was both valuable and horrifying. Kellerman's men spoke casually about murder, robbery, and worse, treating violence as just another tool of their trade. She learned that the missing town officials were indeed dead, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the desert outside Cedar Falls. She discovered that Kellerman was planning to loot the town's remaining resources before moving on to his next target. Most importantly, she overheard details about the gang's security arrangements and patrol schedules. Near midnight, as the saloon began to empty out, Clara found herself serving drinks to two men who were deep in conversation about Kellerman's future plans. "Boss says we'll be pulling out next week," one of them said, his words slurred from whiskey. "Soon as we clean out that last cache of gold coins from the bank vault." "About time," his companion replied. "This place is played out anyway. Not enough money left to make it worth your while." "Where are we heading next?" the first man asked. "Boss mentioned something about a railroad town called Fairview, about 100 miles south of here. Supposed to have a lot of cash moving through on account of the cattle shipping." Clara's blood ran cold. Fairview was one of the communities she and Jake had helped clean up earlier in their partnership. Good people lived there, people who had already suffered enough corruption and violence. She couldn't let Kellerman's gang descend on them like a plague of locusts. As she continued serving drinks, Clara began formulating modifications to their original plan. The information she'd gathered changed everything. They couldn't wait for territorial authorities to arrive, because Kellerman would be gone long before help could reach Cedar Falls. Near 2 in the morning, Clara finally had the opportunity she'd been waiting for. Most of Kellerman's men had either passed out drunk or wandered off to their rooms, leaving only a skeleton crew to guard the premises. Using the skills Jake had taught her about moving silently and avoiding detection, she slipped out through her window and made her way to the predetermined meeting point where Jake was waiting. "Clara," Jake whispered urgently as she appeared out of the darkness. "Thank God you're safe. I was starting to worry when you didn't show up at the regular time." "I had to wait for the right opportunity," Clara explained quickly. "Jake, the situation is worse than we thought. Kellerman murdered the town officials, and he's planning to leave next week for Fairview." Jake's face hardened as Clara shared everything she'd learned during her time in the saloon. The scope of Kellerman's crimes was staggering, and the threat to future communities made it clear that they couldn't afford to let him escape. "We're going to have to move tomorrow night," Jake decided. "I've been in contact with Marshal Crawford. By telegraph, he's bringing a full company of territorial marshals, but they won't arrive for at least 4 days." "That's too late," Clara said firmly. "By then, Kellerman will be gone, and we'll never catch up to him. We have to act now with the resources we have." They spent the next hour revising their plans based on Clara's intelligence. The operation would be more dangerous than anything they'd attempted before, but it offered their only chance of stopping Kellerman before he could escape or harm more innocent people. The next evening, as the sun set over Cedar Falls, Jake Morrison and Clara Whitmore put their plan into action. Dr. Hayes's smoke bombs created chaos and confusion in the main street, while Martha Crawford led the women and children to safety in the surrounding hills. The signal fires blazed to life on the ridgelines, alerting distant authorities that Cedar Falls was under attack. But the centerpiece of the operation was Clara's return to the saloon, this time armed and accompanied by Jake, who had infiltrated the building through the rear entrance while the gang's attention was focused on the disturbances in the street. "Silas Kellerman," Clara called out as she burst through the saloon doors, her deputy's badge gleaming on her chest and her gun drawn. "You're under arrest for murder, robbery, and conspiracy." The saloon erupted into chaos as Kellerman's men reached for their weapons, but Jake was already in position to cover Clara's advance. His shots were precise and deadly, dropping 2 of the gang members before they could clear leather. Kellerman himself dove behind the bar, shouting orders to his remaining men and trying to organize a defense. But the combination of surprise, superior tactics, and righteous fury proved too much for the demoralized gang. The gunfight was brief but intense. When the smoke cleared, Silas Kellerman lay wounded but alive, surrounded by the bodies of his followers who had chosen to fight rather than surrender. The reign of terror that had gripped Cedar Falls was finally over. As Jake and Clara stood together in the wreckage of the Red Moon Saloon, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years had passed since that terrible morning when Clara had been dragged through the streets of Millbrook in chains, condemned to die for another man's crime. Now she wore a badge of her own, and together they had brought justice to communities throughout the territory. "It's over," Clara said quietly, holstering her weapon as the townspeople began emerging from their hiding places to reclaim their community. "This one's over," Jake corrected, putting his arm around her shoulders. "But there are other towns out there, other people who need our help. The work continues." Clara smiled and leaned into his embrace, feeling the satisfaction that came from a job well done and justice served. The woman who had once been a victim of corruption and violence had become an instrument of justice and hope. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning in Millbrook, Clara Whitmore became Clara Morrison in a ceremony attended by friends from across the territory. Marshall Crawford served as Jake's best man, while Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton stood as Clara's matron of honor. The same church where Clara had once sat alone in the back pew was now filled with people who had come to celebrate the union of two remarkable individuals who had found love in the midst of chaos and forged a partnership that would be remembered throughout the frontier. As they rode away from their wedding reception toward their next assignment, Jake and Clara Morrison faced the future with confidence and determination. They had proven that even in the harshest corners of the frontier, truth and justice could prevail when good people were willing to fight for them. The chains that had once bound Clara in disgrace had long since been broken, replaced by bonds of love, partnership, and shared purpose that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Their story had begun with betrayal and false accusations, but it would continue with hope, justice, and the unshakable conviction that no evil was too powerful to overcome when faced with courage and righteousness. Together, they would ride into legend, the cowboy who threw away his badge to save an innocent woman, and the seamstress who became a symbol of justice throughout the American frontier. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.